What can we propose that can take away, in a sense, that curse, that difficulty of death having such a conquering power? Is the existence of God only imagination or wishful thinking? In other words, most people who seem to have an answer to death or seem not to let death get them down would be sometimes Christian people who say, well, but there's a God, and he said some things. But wait a minute, how would we know there's a God? Is that just imagination? Is that just wishful thinking? What clues do we have, even to start with, that there might be somebody home in the universe that's big enough to explain all this? Well, when you look in the universe, some maintain that what you see are the fingerprints of God, evidence for the fingerprints of God. Let me put up something that is going to, make you feel nauseous. Look at those mathematical equations. Do you realize that those mathematical equations describe on one page, on one side of one piece of paper, the universe? In other words, it can be reduced down to a few mathematical expressions. Why should that be? If in fact the universe is the result of chance, not intelligence, then you should not expect an orderly universe. You should expect a chaotic universe, not one that fits into mathematical equations. Here's what Einstein said. I don't know if you know, Einstein was not an atheist. Incredible mind, incredible mathematician, scientist. But he was a theist. He believed there was a God. He was not a Christian, but he nevertheless believed there had to be a God behind the universe. And he said this statement: the most incomprehensible thing about the universe or world is that it is comprehensible. He says we have no right to expect it to be comprehensible. I mean, if any of you had kids and they had their own room, look at their clothes in the room. Things go from a state of order to a state of disorder. Without intelligence, without energy being put into it, things disintegrate, things go into chaos. He said, but when I look in the world, I see mathematical equations that describe the world. That's impossible if it's a result of chance. Let me give you one more illustration before we actually go into discuss the possibility of God's existence. Biology, my major. Every one of us here are the result of an information system. The information system is called DNA. We each have 46 chromosomes of information in each cell of our bodies. Scientists have looked at the 46 chromosomes of the human, and they started to take it apart and found out they're made up of chemical letters. Strings and strings and strings of chemical letters. And so they wanted to know how many chemical letters are there that are in the instructions for making a baby. Because after all, it starts with a sperm and an egg, and then it has to divide, and then it has to become noses and eyes and fingers and fingernails and everything else. Where are the instructions coming from to make that happen? It's coming from DNA, from those chemical letters that are catalyzing the reactions. When they published the results of their study, there were 3.1 billion letters of instruction to make a baby. How many letters is 3.1 billion? Too many for us to appreciate. Let's try something we can understand. This is a Bible. It has 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament, 66 in total. Start from the beginning. Count the number of letters on each page. When you get to the end of the New Testament, now add up the letters on all the pages. How many letters make up the entire Bible? 4 million. 4 million letters in the entire Bible. What are the odds, in your estimation, that these letters could have come together in this precise sequence for the entire Bible by chance without any intellectual involvement? Pretty absurd, would you think? Not going to happen. I don't care how many letters you throw out of airplanes on the interstate. Year after year, 1,000,000 years, you probably will never get a word, much less all of them in this precise sequence. 4 million. In order to get a baby, you have to have chemical letters equivalent to a stack of Bibles of 800. And that's how many letters have to be in precise sequence, or you're going to have an embryological flaw. It will read wrong. What are the odds that 3.1 billion letters could come together by chance? Not trial and error. Otherwise they die. The Bible says that's exactly the first place we should look, is in nature. That which is known about God is evident, for since the creation of the world, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are, say it with me, without excuse. In other words, God truly expects that everyone would realize there must be an intelligence behind the universe from the observation of the creation itself. But some deny that. After all, if you have been, like me, in undergraduate, graduate school, all the way up through higher degrees, what you're going to hear is evolution is the answer to how it all came to be. And evolution operates by chance, not by intelligence. What's the basis? What do they use to defend their skepticism? Grab your book. A parable was concocted by an atheist, and it is used in universities actually around the world. And many, maybe freshmen, sophomore, other students, have found this compelling to jettison their faith in God. Why? Let's listen to what Dr. Anthony Flew says. Once upon a time, two explorers come upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds, and one explorer says, "Some gardener must tend this plot." The other disagrees. "There's no gardener." So they pitch their tents, and they set up a watch. No gardener's ever seen. But perhaps he's an invisible gardener. Well, so they set up a barbed wire fence around it. They electrify it. They patrol it with bloodhounds. But no shrieks ever suggest that some intruder has received a shock. No movements of the wire ever betray an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never give cry. Yet still the believer is not convinced, but there is a gardener who's invisible, who's insensible to electric shocks, a gardener who comes secretly to look after this garden which he loves. At last, the skeptic despairs. But what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, and eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all? His position, of course, is that if God is invisible, intangible, and elusive, how do you know you're not just imagining it? How is that any different from no God at all? Grab the sheets. In the middle, it has the parable of Dr. Flew. Underneath that, it has some questions. We're going to do a couple of them at least now. What does Dr. Flew want us to identify with the gardener? God. The illustration of the parable is to equate the gardener with God. What does he want us to understand is the garden? The world. You and I are in the world. And we're on tiptoe looking out there and saying, I don't see anything. Where would it be? He's invisible. He's intangible. He's eternally elusive. The third question, what characteristics did he identify with the gardener? Look on the screen. You're looking for yellow letters. The gardener, or God, is invisible. He's intangible. He's eternally elusive. Are these characteristics true of the biblical or Christian God? Hold on to that. We're going to answer the rest of the questions in a few moments. Let's take a look at this. If there is a God, in order for God to be known, in order for God to be truly God and be helpful to us in terms of our purpose and meaning, there's some qualities God would have to have. Two are absolutely essential. One, God would have to be infinite. What did we say everything was inside the triangle? Finite, limited, dependent on something else. Only if God too were finite, God would be scratching his head and saying, I wonder where I came from. Wonder where my purpose and meaning is in life. But God has to be infinite, or else it does no good for us who are finite in the world. The second thing is that God would need to be personal. By personal, I don't mean personality. What I'm talking about is the ability to have intellect, to have a will to make choices, and to have emotion. Intellect, will, and emotion is a very short and brief way to describe the qualities of a person. I want my God to be able to reciprocate. Not one-sided, not one-directional. And so I maintain to you that to be an infinite and a personal God is required. Let's look with just those two qualities. Let's look at the religions of the world. Let's look at the East. You go to Hinduism, go to Buddhism. And I know this is a broad brush. There are little splinter groups within these that might be exceptions. But for the most part, the East has the concept of a God that is infinite. So infinite that they have a concept that God is all, and all is God. Everything is God. It's called pantheism. But in the East, God's not a personal being. There's no relationship. You don't think of God in that way. Well, let's try again. Let's go over to the West, the Greeks, the Nordic peoples. You read the Greek mythologies, and you read about the gods of the Greeks. Do they seem to be persons? Yeah. Yeah, they really are. But they have more problems than people do. They fight and they lust and they're really bad. In other words, they're personal beings, but they're not infinite. They're not big enough to be gods. They're just like we are, finite. But what in the world? Where are we going to find a religion that has both an infinite and a personal God in the same God, the one they believe in? Well, there are three: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. All maintain that the God they serve is a personal being. But that personal being is also an infinite being. Knows all powerful, there are no exceptions. Well, then they must be all the same. Or are they? Let's find out. Let's look. What about Judaism and Islam? What do they maintain? How do they know that they have an infinite and a personal God? These little curls things, those are sound waves. God communicated to them through a written document, proving that he must be a personal being with intellect and the ability to communicate in language. And in it he says, I am the creator of it all. Therefore he must be infinite. Both Judaism and Islam base primarily their conviction about their God on the basis of their holy books that they received from their God. At that point, you'd say, well, Christianity is just like it. I mean, they have their holy book too, and so forth. But wait a minute. If you really understand Christianity, they have a different point. Christians claim that their God came to the world he created as a personal being and lived here for 33 years. No other religion in the world has a claim like that. course, I didn't show you that it's necessarily true. All I'm telling you is what Christianity says and what it claims and what sets it apart from the other two. So the clue for intelligent design in nature is supplemented by direct evidence. His fingerprints are also detectable in history. So God's fingerprints are detectable in nature, and I didn't go much into that, but his fingerprints, Christians claim, is detectable in history. Discovery number 2. Christianity alone claims we can know that God exists because he came to earth physically as the man Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. That's discovery number 2. That's extremely, extremely significant. Let's go back to Dr. Flu's parable, if you got those sheets handy. The second part of 3. Are these characteristics true of the biblical or Christian God? That is, invisible, intangible, eternally elusive. What did I just say? Is this Christian God invisible? No. He became flesh, lived with us. We beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, the Scripture says. So the parable shouldn't work against Christian college students, but it does, because they don't know the uniqueness of Christianity. It's never dawned on them how to respond to this. Let's go on. Why is a parable a more serious challenge for all religions except Christianity? Let's look at these passages. Notice there it says, what's the significance of John 1:14 to this? The Word became flesh. He made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. 4 verses later, John tells us, no one has ever seen God. But God, the one and only, is in reference to who? Jesus Christ, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. God came in to the world he created and revealed his identity. You can't get his identity from nature, only his existence. History is required to get his identity. What about the part B? What's the significance of Matthew chapter 1:23? I showed you this before, but let's get the verse out there. The virgin, the angel says, will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. In other words, the angel announces that his name will be Emmanuel, which means he will be God with us on planet Earth. In view of the above, can you understand and explain why the Apostle John is so excited as he writes his first New Testament letter, 1 John chapter 1, verse 1? The Apostle John was with Jesus when he was here 2,000 years ago. He was one of Jesus' disciples. What did John say when he started writing? We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, whom we have heard and seen. We saw him with our own eyes. We touched him with our own hands. He is the word of life. Is he invisible? No. He was able to be seen. He was heard. He could be touched and handled with hands. He's not a ghost. He was a real person. We have a long ways to go yet to be able to demonstrate that this person was indeed God. I haven't assumed that here yet. I'm only taking you a step at a time to understand what Christianity says about this. And so, at the bottom, number 6, if you were talking to someone who used Dr. Flu's argument against the existence of God, identify 3 external evidences for God's existence that you could share. I only gave that to you so you could go home. Grab a Bible and look it up for yourself. Romans 1:18-20 says you can know that God exists because of nature. John 1:14 and in verse 18, because of history. He appeared in history. His fingerprints are in nature. He appeared in history. And the last one, 2 Corinthians 3:18, points out one of the soft evidences for the existence of God is the transformed lives of the people who embrace him through faith. That's soft evidence. It's not a hard evidence, because some people say there are other people who live well, there are other people who have life changes as well, but it's consistent. Those who have found faith in God as a living relationship have a uniform and consistent lifestyle change. That becomes an evidence for God. So those three give you a start on your response. How can we know that God truly exists?